Now, I'm specifically focusing here on Thomas Jefferson because it's generally thought that Thomas Jefferson was the most secular of our founding fathers. His words are often twisted and erroneously cited to support complete government neutrality on religious matters. Because of the popular portrait of Jefferson as some kind of radical secularist and an enemy of religion, Christians are sometimes inclined to completely dismiss Jefferson. But that's a mistake. A parenthetical phrase taken out of context in a letter that he wrote to Baptist ministers in Danbury, Connecticut, has been used to distort the true Jefferson. Ignored, for example, are Jefferson's regulations for the University of Virginia, which he founded, a state university. Students at the University of Virginia under Jefferson were required to attend religious worship services on the Lord's Day. Jefferson saw no conflict between this and the First Amendment of the Constitution, and no conflict between this and separation of church and state. Whether or not Jefferson himself was a Christian is perhaps open to question. He was a vestryman in his church. He was actively involved in his church. He went to church every Lord's Day. And as the rules for the students at the University of Virginia certainly demonstrate, Jefferson believed that religious ideas, that religious precepts were essential to education and the development of character in the students. So, as part of the University of Virginia, Jefferson also established a professional school of theology and ecclesiastical history, the purpose of which was to train ministers. He also ordered that any student caught deriding that which is, quote, sacred and holy would be grounds for dismissal from the University of Virginia. I can't imagine many college deans today enforcing that regulation. Now, both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison led the battle in Virginia to disestablish the Anglican Church as the official church of the state, and they passed the Virginia Act for establishing religious freedom. Now, that was an important law in our constitutional history because that law served as a kind of a model for the Constitution's religion clause in the First Amendment. But usually omitted from this history is the fact that James Madison, probably with the help of Thomas Jefferson, also wrote and advocated and passed a bill providing for the punishment of disturbers of religious worship and Sabbath breakers. In fact, this bill providing for the punishment of Sabbath breakers passed the very same day, October 31, 1785, as Madison's and Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom. So they saw no conflict between religious freedom and also a law passed the very same day by the Virginia Assembly providing for the punishment of Sabbath breakers. That law providing for the punishment of disturbers of religious worship and Sabbath breakers included the following language, and I'll quote it. Quote, "If any person on Sunday shall himself be found laboring at his own or any other trade or calling, or shall employ the apprentices or servants or other business, except it be in ordinary household offices of daily necessity or other work of necessity or charity, he shall forfeit the sum of 10 shillings for every such offense." So if you're caught breaking the Sabbath, not being in church, working on the Lord's Day, or asking others to work, employing others to work, you would be fined 10 shillings for every such offense. Jefferson wrote many of the bills introduced by James Madison in Virginia, and probably wrote that one as well. Jefferson was the great writer. I think even those alarmed today by the general moral laxity of our culture and deterioration of religious life would probably consider a law providing for the punishment of Sabbath breakers as a bit extreme. But James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, they saw no conflict between that and guaranteeing religious freedom. By the way, religious freedom in those days meant the freedom to choose the Christian denomination of your choice. You were expected to be in church or synagogue on the Lord's Day. There was, by the way, a pretty significant Jewish population in America at that time. Jewish people were also persecuted by the Anglican Church in England and other official state-run churches throughout Europe, and so a sizable number of Jewish people came to America where they were allowed to worship freely. And by the way, throughout the 17th century, the Jewish people and the Puritans in America got along very well. There was really no conflict or problem at all between them. The Puritans had so much respect for Judaism and the Old Testament that there was a time in Puritan New England when Hebrew almost became our national language, because Hebrew, of course, is the language of the Old Testament, which is most of the Bible. So there was no conflict between the 17th century American Puritans and the Jewish people. In fact, they had a lot in common. So even in Thomas Jefferson's day, the law was that you had better be in a religious service of some kind on the Lord's Day, a church if you're a Christian, a synagogue if you were Jewish, or you would be subject to a stiff fine. But that's not all. Also, on that same day that Jefferson and Madison introduced their bill for religious freedom in Virginia, Madison introduced another bill, again probably written by Jefferson, that provided for, quote, the appointing of days of public fasting and thanksgiving, which called for forfeiting 50 pounds for every failure not having a reasonable excuse. In other words, if you weren't observing this day of public fasting and thanksgiving, you would be fined 50 pounds. So it's pretty clear that Jefferson's and Madison's view of religious freedom would not involve the Supreme Court mandating that the Ten Commandments be torn off the bulletin boards in public schools, or require that there would be any restrictions on prayer in the public schools or in the schools whatsoever. Again, the Religion Clause of the First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The obvious and clear intent of the First Amendment was to protect a religious people from the government, not to protect government from a religious people. The entire Constitution, in fact, is about placing restraints on the federal government, which is only empowered to do a few specific tasks, none of which involves interfering in the religious lives of the states. Congress shall make no law. That's the operative phrase. Congress shall make no law. Nothing is said here about the states in the First Amendment. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut all had officially recognized religious establishments, supported by tax revenue, for more than a half a century after the First Amendment was passed. In fact, it was the established churches that were among the most vociferous proponents of the Religion Clause in the First Amendment, because they were worried about federal interference in the religious practices of the states. Although it was James Madison who first introduced the First Amendment, it was actually the version proposed by Fisher Ames, a Congregationalist from Massachusetts, that was adopted. The Fisher-Ames version of the First Amendment of the Religion Clause was much more explicit than Madison's in protecting the state religious establishments from federal interference. Fisher-Ames was a staunch defender of the Congregational establishment in Massachusetts. The Congregational Church was the official church, state-supported church of Massachusetts. Now, I'm not here at all suggesting that the state should have official churches supported by tax revenue. I don't support that at all. I think it's a bad idea. I'm just saying, making this one simple, narrow point, that the religious clause of the First Amendment does not prevent states from doing that if they want to. The Religion Clause of the First Amendment only forbids, only outlaws, a national religious establishment, as is suggested by the fact that the First Amendment was not applied to the states at all until 1940. Defenders of liberty should not be excessively alarmed about this, because the religious establishments that existed in America at the start of the 19th century were very mild. For example, each town in Massachusetts was authorized under the state constitution to, quote, make suitable provision at its own expense for the institution of the public worship of God and for the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality, end quote. But under the Massachusetts Constitution, each citizen could designate the church of his preference to which his tax money could be sent. If no church was indicated, his tax equivalent of a tithe would support the Congregationalist church by default.